So thank you everyone who have joined. With your microphone muted. If it's not muted, please mute your microphone. Thank you very much for joining our webinar. I am Dr. Shetty, Managing Director at Consulting and Trading. Today's speaker is Dr. Ryan Cirz, and Dr. Martin will introduce him shortly. I would like to introduce the moderator here, one of my fellow moderators, Dr. Martin Van Dongen, who is the founder and driving force behind AMR Insights. AMR Insights focuses on informing, training, and connecting professionals worldwide active in the fight against AMR. Martin himself is a medical and molecular microbiologist. He did his BSc and MSc at the University of Groningen and obtained his PhD in biochemistry at the University of Amsterdam, both in the Netherlands. Martin has worked for more than 10 years in the pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical industry in several European countries. Following on from this, he has established his own life science consultancy firm. As a microbiologist, Martin received more and more consultancy projects in the field of AMR, and in 2017, he decided to fully focus on AMR's global challenges and founded AMR Insights. Once again, it's our pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. If you have any Q&A or questions during the course of this webinar, please write it at the top left corner under the Q&A tab, and we'll be only taking the questions at the end of the seminar, and Ryan will have an opportunity to answer those. So over to you, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you, Rai, for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's also my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ryan Cirz and you all. You are most likely originating from many different time zones around the globe. I hope you're all safe and doing well. Whether you are enjoying your breakfast, your lunch, or maybe your happy hour, welcome and great to have you with us. It feels to me that we are colleagues jointly fighting antimicrobial resistance, and I think that that feeling of collaboration and being united in our efforts is great and pretty much exclusive for the challenging AMR arena we're all in together. This is the first webinar of a new series of webinars on antimicrobial resistance as one of the biggest global threats of health and food safety, probably worse than COVID-19. This webinar will take 1 hour and consist of 3 parts. A very short 5-minute introduction on AMR Insights, the keynote lecture by Dr. Ryan Cirz, and then last but not least, the Q&A session. And as explained to you already by Raj, you can submit your questions and remarks during the entire course of this webinar. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and that you can always listen afterwards again to the presentation. Thank you so far. Now I would like to introduce briefly AMR Insights. AMR Insights was started in 2017, and basically a few words about antimicrobial resistance. As most of you probably know, this is one of the biggest threats of health and food safety. Nowadays we have something like 700,000 casualties per year. Most likely there are many more than 700,000, and according to well-known AMR review, this number may grow to many millions in the year 2050, with a cumulative GDP loss of $100 trillion. And roughly speaking, there are 5 key strategies to curb antimicrobial resistance, and I will briefly mention them. Of course, the most important is that we do need novel antimicrobials, novel antibiotics. That's also the reason why we have this kickoff webinar with Dr. Ryan Cirz. We desperately need more novel antimicrobials, antibiotics, and also other antimicrobial products. We also need other antimicrobial strategies like, for instance, phage therapy. But we also do need improved diagnostics such that we can much better see what bacteria are there and to what extent they are sensitive or resistant to antibiotics to be used. We do need a better antibiotic stewardship, both in the human as well as in the animal healthcare sector. And of course, we also do need better prevention, better new vaccines. All these 5 key strategies are, desperately needed to better curb AMR. And once again, it's a pleasure to start off to this first webinar with the focus on the novel antimicrobials. About AMR Insights, one of our activities is what mentioned here in the middle below is to organize seminars and webinars related to AMR, to antimicrobial resistance. In combination with the organization of masterclasses on AMR, this is actually our educating pillar. In addition to educating, we also have the informing pillar. We do send out a newsletter to something like 6,000 professionals around the globe, and the information platform welcomes 30 or 35,000 visitors per year. And last but not least, we also have the connecting pillar. We do organize matchmaking symposia and also AMR innovation missions to, for instance, this year to the United Kingdom. And the reason why we organize these sessions, these symposia and these missions is to connect professionals in the domain of AMR. So startups, academia, big pharma companies and so on. So these are our most important activities. We focus on different professional subgroups, so to say. Of course, here at the top right, the innovators, like startups, antibiotics companies, big pharma companies, but also academia, university medical centers who are involved in research and development of novel antimicrobials and diagnostics. But we also focus on professionals in the environmental sector, in the animal health sector, the NGOs of this world, the WHO, organizations like these, CDC, but also, of course, the professionals in the healthcare sector. And last but not least, the professionals involved in the food sector, like the milk and the dairy and the meat sector, because AMR is also an issue in these sectors. So these are broadly the 6 different focal areas we focus on. And then my last slide about AMR Insights is a slide about our ambassador network. This global network was started last year in September, and we now have something like 160 ambassadors in some 50 countries around the globe. And these are all doctors, pharmacists, epidemiologists, entrepreneurs, people working in startup companies, in big pharma companies, diagnostics companies, but also in authorities. And it's really a highly inspiring team of professionals, joining forces actually to add to the curbing of AMR. If you're interested, let me know, and I'm most happy to send you more information. Okay, thank you very much so far for your attention to this brief introduction on AMR Insights. And now I would like to go to the keynote speaker of this first webinar. Once again, welcome Dr. Ryan Cirz. Dr. Ryan Cirz was the founder and vice president of research at Akeoken. As you may know, Akeoken focused on discovering, developing and commercializing innovative antibacterials to treat multi-drug resistant gram-negative infections. Ryan participated in and also led the advancement of 4 homegrown antibacterial assets through investigational new drug applications. 3 of those programs advanced into the clinic, with 2 advancing past phase 1 studies and 1 through US approval in 2018. That was a great success. At Akeoken, Ryan oversaw the pre-IND pipeline and provided support to all things related to infectious diseases, including late-stage development, commercialization, and medical affairs. Ryan has a background in molecular biology and bacterial genetics. He was a graduate researcher at the Scripps Research Institute in California, and he got his PhD in biochemistry, also from the Scripps Research Institute, and his Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry and Molecular Biology from Penn State University in Pennsylvania. Ryan, in all honesty, it's a great pleasure and it's a great honor to have you here, and it's my pleasure to give the virtual floor to you. And I will now make you the presenter.
Great, I'm all ready to share click buttons. All right. How are we doing, Martin? Can you see everything?
Yes, I can see the slides.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I was told to keep my camera off just to help, given we're talking to people around the world for bandwidth. But I promise there's a real person sitting on the other side of the microphone. So thank you for the opportunity to share a story that I've gotten really passionate about sharing. I'm a scientist, and that's what I want to spend all my time focusing on. But doing so in my first stint in my career left me sort of in a place where I'd love to get other scientists aware of some of the issues I got to see, because if we don't fix them, a lot of our science will die on the vine, years down the road. And so appreciate the platform to share this. So really, what are my aims? And I'll talk about another session where we spent quite a long time talking about some of what I'll talk about today, and I'll reference that. But really, I'm kind of coming with an open mind and some stories to hopefully influence really smart people that we have a fundamental problem sustaining the science that the scientists discover because of some of the dynamics in the antibacterial field. And so, I'm trying to come to share what I saw and get your questions and your opinions. So, start thinking as we're going through and hopefully change some minds. And like I said, when I presented something like this in the fall in a live conference, really just we're open-minded, but I see fundamental issues that it's immature for us to ignore any longer. And if we don't fix them, more people will suffer the same consequences that I suffered in my first experience that I'll talk about. Another disclaimer is a lot of what I'm going to show is economic considerations, and they're highly United States centric. And why? Well, because I understand this a lot better. I only got to see just the tip of the iceberg in Europe because we never completed our filing. But also talking to a lot of colleagues, it's still fair to say, and I'm happy to take counterpoints on this, but I have yet to have a single person in industry tell me that the US isn't the best case scenario. And actually, when you move to Europe, things just get a lot more difficult because the government sets the pricing and because it's a lot more expensive. You have to go to every single country one at a time after you go through central authority. And so basically, the US is a linchpin. If we don't fix it here, how are we going to fix it anywhere? And so that's my explanation for why US centric. So first, why? I'm a scientist. I like doing discovery. I love finding new molecules. I love designing them and finding out if you made a drug in your preclinical and your clinical. But more and more later in my career, I realized all of that work would be for naught if we didn't identify why in this current era of antibiotics we're economically collapsing. But just to tell you sort of the length of this story, as was mentioned in the introduction, in 2003, I arrived at Scripps, or 2002, out in California, where I was doing my graduate work, looking at fluoroquinolone resistance and how quinolones cause DNA damage and can accelerate mutations, essentially. That was actually the founding technology for Achaogen and the thesis of its name, AKO, meaning against chaos, against change, mutation, so sort of anti-evolution. And the company was founded almost immediately after I got to Scripps from the university and then formed up in Northern California. So I got to watch it from the first day. And really what evolved early in the company was a vision that in the early 2000s, a concern over the gram-negative issue that we know today, that essentially ESBL fluoroquinolone resistance would drive carbapenem use. And then we'd end up using carbapenems for simple diseases like CUTI. That was unthinkable back in 2005 when we were thinking about what Achaogen wanted to do. That is common practice now. We kind of all laugh and say, yeah, we use carbapenems every day for UTIs. But we were really worried about that. And so the plasmamycin program was one of many programs, but the main thesis of the company was gram negatives. So how long did this program take place over? Essentially, the molecule was first made in 2006. We entered phase 1 in 2008. Hard chemistry, so really hard GMP program in the beginning. We actually did a phase 2 in 2010, which shows you how long ago this was, because nowadays, if you've got a great program with clear goals, you don't often do a phase 2. And then we had a very long gap after we finished phase 2 because we hit this issue with the development path where it was still the traditional multiple large trials. So to a 2,000 patient UTI study and a 2,000 patient intra-abdominal study. And we were sort of neck and neck with what became avibactam, but that molecule was supported by 2 large pharmaceutical companies, and we were one of, not the only, but one of the first small entities trying to take it forward on our own. And ultimately, through discussions with the regulators, what became our registrational study was a superiority mortality study in CRE, focused largely in Greece and Turkey, where in this time period, the only drug really available was colistin. So we're a few years away from avibactam supposed to be approved. It ended up being approved sooner than everyone expected for some interesting reasons. So that program started. We struggled mightily. There's an entire FDA workshop around the trial. And essentially, we were given the opportunity to run a single pivotal non-inferiority UTI study, which this combination of trials is now the first example of what we call Tier B, John referenced Tier B streamlined development. And so that was a really proud moment. Now we have this pathway to get drugs approved in a streamlined fashion. Of course, for us, it took us about 12 years as long because we had to build the ship while we were. The phase 3s end and the top line data come out. That's probably our peak of excitement because the data, in my opinion, were very strong. We got breakthrough therapy designation for the drug, which was the first time an antibiotic has ever received that. The NDA was filed pretty shortly after, given we're a small company. And then we approved and launched almost in direct succession, only a couple weeks apart, which is actually really difficult to launch right after approval. You have to make substantial investments to do that. Right after launch, we were awarded NTAP designation, which is a thing in the US that Medicare does to say this drug is worth extra reimbursement because it provides significant benefit to Medicare patients. The point is, you kind of got all the accolades you could get along the way, and then we declared bankruptcy. So that was the 15 years of work. Basically, within 9 months of being on the market, we were bankrupt. The other thing to note is, this was a 15-year period to go through all this. It's actually 20% of the entire time we've had antibiotics total. So it's pretty amazing because I think of this as a flash in the pan, a blip in time where I contributed one asset to the pipeline. But it's basically a fit of the entire worldwide experience with all antibiotics. So it shows how long this struggle can be. So why did we go bankrupt, and why would I ever do this again if we didn't have a fix by the time we get to the market? That's essentially why I'm talking to you about this today as a scientist. So just to set your mind on where I'm going to focus, if you think about development in a couple different chunks, and I don't want to belabor numbers here, but essentially the preclinical phase before you start trials can be anything you want it to be. Until you file an IND with the FDA, whatever people call preclinical can be anything. So you could spend anywhere from a year to 10 years working preclinical. But you spend tens of millions of dollars. Certainly just to file the IND, you're spending $10 million. And obviously at this point you have no money coming back, no revenue. And then phase 1 studies, a couple years to do the series of phase 1s, same approximate amount of money. These 3 studies now, because of streamlined development, are actually pretty rapid. Our ultimate registrational phase 3 enrolled in 8 months, which is pretty darn good. And they don't cost all that much money. You're doing something straightforward like an intra-ab or UTI study. If you try to do a pneumonia study from the start, you're probably but now that we have streamlined development, the costs and the time have come down. I think the FDA has done an amazing job giving us tools to get to approval. Here's the problem. When we get to approval, it's just a lot worse, not better. And so the next phase I'm calling the branded life. This is your opportunity where you're going to spend a ton of money, and we'll talk about why. More than you spent to get to approval, but you'll make money here. And this is the only time you make money. And if you don't make enough money to make all of the other red numbers worth it, the whole enterprise doesn't work. Further, if you don't make enough money to at least match what you're spending at that moment, forget about the other stuff you already spent, you will go bankrupt. And that's what we're seeing, and the why is what I'd like to talk about. But if you think about the last phase being sort of the generic life, for antibiotics, the vast majority of the value is extracted in the generic life. And there's basically minimal returns for the innovator company. There's a tremendous amount of work they do to get the drug to approval, and there's a tremendous amount of work they do that I'll talk about that's less understood that they do once you're approved. The generic never does this. So this group of people invest a tremendous amount of money, and they don't make it back in this window. they're going to not do it ever again. And we're kind of in that point. So that's where I want to focus is how do you make enough money during the branded life, make all of this red worth it plus a return before you go generic. And then society benefits for the next 50 years from all that.
Ryan, sorry to interrupt you for a second. Your sound is pretty fragmented. I invite you to speak as clearly as possible, possibly near the microphone you have. Thank you.
Attached to my head. I'll do, let me know again if it continues. So the first, why are companies with meaningful products going bankrupt? The thesis, at approval, costs exceed revenues. So you're spending more than you're making, even after approval. The deficit of those losses require money to cover that. And the small companies can no longer access that money. And I'll talk mathematically why. And then why are products losing money? Well, the costs are more than their revenues. Why? The costs are what I'll claim and I'll show is they're the normal operating costs of making a sterile injectable drug. And it's really the lack of revenues that are driving collapse. And then why are revenues so low? Well, it's limitations on price and the amount of use. So we get to, if we don't solve these numbers, the whole system doesn't work. So why at approval do costs exceed revenues? And there's a link at the bottom that's a 2-hour boot camp discussing costs specifically that I'll reference and leverage from, but obviously extract smaller amounts of data. But a rough breakdown of what we talked about for 2 hours in this boot camp was colloquially stuff you need to do to keep the drug on the market. So that's the red here. Making drug, obviously, you can't sell it if you don't make it. And then what we're calling broadly field support. So people out all over the world. A lot of people call it sales. It is kind of, but it's a lot more than that. And so these are the things you have to spend once you're approved to continue to operate as a business. One of the least understood from a startup scientist like me thing is that when you're approved, there's actually quite a number of things that you have to do by mandate in the United States. And so these are 2 NDA approval letters from, I just wanted to pick one I didn't work on. So Paratex, omadacycline, and Achaogen's plasmamycin. But you can actually, these are open documents. You can Google, plasmamycin approval letter, and on the FDA site, you can look at the letter. And it says, congratulations, you have a drug. Here are the 10 things you have to do or you're in trouble. You'll be fined, your drug could be removed. I don't know if it dictates the penalties, but the point is that is the penalty. And so when you're approved, there's actually things we call post. And you can change the letter you want to see what they are. But the number one thing, it's always at least a pediatric study. And that's for every indication you sought. So the more indications you actually got when you got approval, the worse it is in terms of cost because you have to do a pediatric study for each one. There might be additional PK and safety studies. And sometimes the worst case, there's actually do-overs. You're approved, but you have to redo your entire phase 3 study. That's a $90 or $100 million oopsie. Like that's a big expense at the beginning. And then of course you have to spend several $1 million doing microbiology work. And then of course, the other piece is you need a group of people and a system to report and track any product concerns because now you're selling drug. And then you have to provide quarterly and annual reports to the FDA to update them on anything with microbiology, safety. Generic, largely they can reference all the work you did. And so it's one of those injustices that you're doing a lot of this work for somebody else eventually someday. But it costs a lot of money. The other things that are kind of legally, I don't think you have to do these, but you can't use the drug if you don't. You have to get your drug onto the testing device, things that doctors and pharmacists and microbiologists use to say, does this new drug work or not? Some of those activities you have to wait till you're approved because you get a break point from the FDA, and then the vendors have to go complete their work. You have to continue that work, or no one can test whether your drug works or not. And then, of course, medical affairs. So this is more optional, but anytime you see a speaker or a booth or a poster or paper, somebody's paying to have those studies done. At minimal, at least paying for drug supply, but likely sponsoring the actual study. And so if you don't do anything, you could theoretically let the drugs with the things on this slide versus the previous. But typically, if you don't do this, nobody will know about your product. This was from my colleague Kevin Krause, who cited in the acknowledgments at the end from our longer session on cost, and it basically summarizes. And these were actually 3 real-world cases that the panelists had worked on. We just didn't want to identify the drugs by name, but these were actually 3 programs that had different sort of approval packages, and their total cost for trials and non-clinical work after approval in the first 5 years. And so the predominant driver, things like pediatric studies, additional trials, and medical affairs. You can see you're spending $100 to $200 million on additional work. Some of it, a decent amount of it, required by statute, by law, to be allowed to sell the product. And so that's sort of the first bucket, stuff you have to do to keep the drug on market. Are we doing okay, Martin?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. All right, so making drug. Everyone agrees you can't sell drug if you don't make it. Now, what's changing as you're reaching approval? You've just gone from running a clinical trial and you're investing a tremendous amount of money in your CMC program, making drug, quality drug under CGMP. But often at approval, you're transferring that process to a different facility. So you may be making it for only 1,000 patients worth of dosing in a smaller facility. And that same vendor may then want to move you to their commercial facility, right? That has bigger, chromatography or bigger facilities. You also, if you're wise, are bringing a second factory online somewhere else in the world. Because if you have one source in one location, I mean, COVID's a great example, but hurricanes, anything, you could be cut off from drug supply for years. So generally, you're bringing multiple factories online. And then there are different steps in the process I'll show. So you're trying to find the right balance where if you had a drug that was selling like a cancer drug, or something like a Keytruda or Humira even, you're going to not ever want to run out of drug. And you're making so much money, you're going to invest dramatic amounts of money to make sure you have redundancy everywhere in your supply chain. If you want to take a tremendous amount of risk and say, if there's a hurricane in Puerto Rico, I don't have drug for 4 years, you can do it in the low-cost way. And generally, we were always aiming for kind of the balanced middle. We've got a product we don't want to run out, but we're willing to take some risks because of the cost involved. But you can see the middle case is still hundreds of millions of dollars in the first 5 years. And why? Well, I'm not a chemist, although I work with a lot of chemists. You think about, just synthesize the drug, but when you're doing GMP commercial synthesis, a supply chain map looks kind of like this. You've got source materials that are CGMP compliant, raw materials that are coming from all over the world that you bring together in 1 or 2 factories to make the actual powder, the drug substance. Then you warehouse that somewhere because you're going to want some left as drug substance in the supply chain in case something happens later. You want this whole pipe you basically want full. So if something happens, you're not waiting 2 years to get more material. But ultimately, for most antibiotics we're talking about, you're bringing it to a facility that has to do sterile, injectable drug product manufacturing. And that is the most challenging, most expensive thing to do. It's being injected into your vein. And the factories that have to do this have to be incredibly well controlled to the point where employees have to walk around at a certain speed so as not to disrupt the airflow in the facility. That's how serious that kind of manufacturing is. And you can see it's not that you just pick up a phone and say, hey, give me, in 2021, I need twice the amount of drug that we sold in 2020. You would actually have a 22-month lead time just to get to finished product. And this is a median case. I have definitely, in the last 5 years, done diligence on programs that have a 36-month end-to-end. I've never seen a 1 year. This is kind of the average. But what it tells you is if you don't spend a lot of money to fill in the pipeline and all these different steps, and you have a sudden loss of product or an increase in demand, it will take you years to react to that change in demand if you don't put money into this. And then the obvious thing that's kind of undeniable is if the curve goes, if you're going to sell more drug next year than you sold this year, at least in the early years, right? It's supposed to be a curve going up, but it takes you 2 years to make drug. You're going to be making more drug than you're selling by definition, because you have to make drug for 2022 this year. And So as you're ramping your production at approval, you're spending a lot more money making drug that you're not selling because you're anticipating 2 years from now, we'll be selling more than we're selling this year. So all of this stuff, unfortunately, is the most expensive it will ever be right at approval because you're doing all this work to get the pipeline filled, to predict demand, to get process efficiencies built in. You're maybe even doing supplemental work to your NDA to change something to make it more efficient. This is all the work that later, when the drug's generic, you can just reference and say, thanks for doing that work. Here's how we're going to do it. And so it's a tremendous investment to do this. Last piece I'll just touch on briefly is the field support. In the longer workshop on cost, we assumed that people would say, just don't have Salesforce. I'm a scientist too. I'm like, I'll just get rid of the salespeople and it'll all work. So we spent a lot more time focusing on the making drug and stuff you have to do by law, because you can't deny that has to be done. But it's important to note that the field people, and I followed a lot of our field force around the country for 6 months, just kind of watching. Most of their work is providing educational materials or fielding questions back to medical affairs. So they take a question, they intake it, give it to medical affairs, and they can answer it. So they're really honestly enabling people to understand the drug and start to do anything they can to ensure that the formulation process can proceed. And that's the process where you would say a drug is now allowed to be used at hospital X. And similar to the manufacturing issue, there's substantial delays to get onto formulary. 2 years, especially when you have a health system and then you have to go through the systems process. That might have 3 different committees, like the stewardship committee, the P&T committee, and then you finally get approval, and then you go to each hospital. You could imagine each of those, if those groups meet only once a quarter, you're around the calendar and you're ready a year and a half in. And so all this time, spending a tremendous amount doing trials you have to do, mandated by your approval, making a ton of drug no one's buying. You have to send a ton of people all over the country to help hospitals that won't even have the drug on formulary for a year. So there's a huge lag to actually how much money you're bringing in versus how much you're spending. And it's the worst right after you're approved. So how deep is that hole? That's what our thesis was in the prior workshop was, why is everyone going bankrupt? It's these costs. How deep is it? So this was shared in that workshop, again, the longer one on cost. That you take everything up to approval and say, that's wiped out, it's free. So you spent nothing to get to NDA. Now, how do you stand on your own 2 feet? It actually, on median, and this is, again, multiple products average, it's about 7 years until your revenue that year is greater than your expense. That doesn't mean you're profitable. That means that year you're profitable. That doesn't mean you've even made back what you spent since approval. Never mind made enough back that you've rewarded the people that did the development to get the drug to approval. And so that's the whole. And effectively, you're spending over the first 7 years, you're spending about $420 million more than you're making for these product examples that we looked at. And so that's the number one issue. If you did this with a charity and said charities get drugs approved and then companies have to sell them, you'd still lose money. This is the phase that's bankrupting everyone. And so I never worked on AbbVie, so this is only from public sources. It's the best I could do. But part of the reason I'm willing to talk about a specific drug is I didn't work on it. And now these are from public sources, not from my colleagues. But it's a sad case because I think this is a really important drug. It was accelerated in its approval for good reasons. It meets a high unmet need. It was the first mover in the CRE space. And these are the U.S. sales since approval in 2015. And unfortunately, Allergan didn't have their earnings call yesterday, I was hoping, because we want to look at Q1 2020. But the early indicators were that potentially the sales are flattening, meaning it's going to stop around 100. Because now we've got Vabomere, imipenem-relebactam, plasmamycin, ribociclib, cefiderocol. The first few years, the drug was alone on the market, and now it's got a bunch of competitors. But the sad part is, and I had a fear this was true, if you add all of the revenue to date since they got approval, it's about $300 million. And if you look at their NDA approval letters, which I looked up, they were initially approved for intra-AB and UTI, and it came with these requirements, PEDS UTI, PEDS intra-AB, and they actually asked for a PEDS neonatal sepsis. plus a microbiology study because there were concerns around resistance to avibactam. So those were the first studies that all had to be done that were eating into this money, right? They had to do all this work. Also, while this was happening, they ran a pneumonia study, which is what doctors want us to do. Do more, get us more indications. That's why we're not using your product. You don't have a HAPVAP label. So they did that at probably the expense of about $150 to $200 million. That I can't say for sure, but that's approximately what a HAPVAP study costs. And their reward for that is the indications on the label, but they also now have to do a pediatric HAPVAP study or some type of pneumonia study. So if you take the cost for 4 pediatric studies and a HAPVAP study, it's easily equal to $300 million, meaning everything they've made since they were approved, they've spent on other trials. And we're not even counting how much has been spent on supply chain investments. And my point with this is the best CRE agent to date, right, in terms of revenue, and it's losing money. And thank God it's in the hands of a big company that has revenue from other products that it can subsidize these losses with. But it shows you why nobody's willing to do this anymore. Big Pharma, all these years, was just subsidizing losses from other products. And that's kind of not their job. We have to make the market work for these products, make them profitable, or people won't lose money on them anymore. And this is just a stark example because I think it's an important drug. And essentially, forget about the fact that you've spent everything you've made so far. Composition patents expire in 2022, but I think they have extensions till 2026, but the patent's going to run out not that long from now. And don't forget, all of the costs to get the drug approved aren't even in any of this. And so it just shows you that these revenues are not enough to return value to investors, bottom line. So then why don't small companies just raise money to pay for this? So how do you cover these losses? So you can use profits from other drugs, and that's in avibactam, that's generally you can do that, right? The company has lots of money from other things. For the small companies like Achaogen, Melinta, Tetraphase, who all went through some form of bankruptcy, you have to raise that money from investors because you don't have other sources of revenue. For all 3 companies, that was the public markets. The other option is take out a loan that has limitations. And so the only choice for a company that doesn't have other revenue is raised in the markets. This is where the bankruptcy comes in. So in general, you need to understand the math here. We need your help. In general, if you're a small company, you can only sell about 20%, even a big company, 20% of your value at a time. You do that once and nobody trusts you again that you're not going to do it again. So it's kind of a one-shot deal. That's just a soft rule. A hard rule is if your value is less than $100 million, you can only raise about a third of that value. So if you're worth $100 million, you can sell $33 million in stock and raise that money. Of course, no one will ever trust you again. You'll never raise again because you've diluted those poor investors so much. But you can, theoretically. If you take the 14 antibiotic companies, and this was supporting our September workshop, so I didn't even look up the number because it's too sad to do it over and over. Maybe they're slightly better, but if you add 14 companies together, their combined value was less than $1 billion. And their average value was about $63 million. So if you take a 20% raise, meaning you're selling 20% of your business to people in the market, share buyers, you can raise $13 million on average, all these companies. So I just showed you the whole is 420. And in one raise, you can raise 13, and you're doing catastrophic damage to your capitalization. Like you're hurting your shareholders bad. How far does $13 or $12 million get you? That's about what it costs to pay your annual auditors to be a public company. So you can exist and do nothing and not pay any employees. That's about how much money you can raise. And so this deficit after approval, the microscopic valuations of the antibiotic companies, meaning they can't raise any money, has led to the bankruptcies. That's essentially why we're where we are. If the companies had revenues from other products, they could choose to invest those in the antibiotic, but they don't, and the markets are no longer allowing them to raise substantial capital. If everybody was just worth $1 billion, because we just said they were, shareholders believed, they could go raise the money they need to get to profitability. But so we've seen this collapse. All right, so the last bit that'll be short is just, okay, there's an equation. The costs are too high and the revenues are too, which one is it? Is it that the costs are out of line or the revenues? And so here's where I'd just like to finish to try to focus the argument. If you look at costs, everything I showed you, I mean, we can not do pediatric trials if we decide that's what we should do to fix it. I don't think we want to do anything for the manufacturing quality. Sterile injectable products are expensive. We can talk about that. But what we're going to do at Bio coming up is really talk about the costs for what antibiotics are doing are really standard. And we can't really reduce lowering standards or requirements, like not doing pediatric trials. Those are the lion's share of the costs. And so we'll talk about that kind of, there's nothing much more we can do on costs, and our costs are normal for any drug. But it's really the revenues killing the field. The revenues are so meager that we can't make this whole system work. All right, so where does revenue come from? So revenue is simple. It's the price you're charging times how much you're using. And then how much you're using is really the number of patients you're treating times the number of doses per patient. And one of the challenges with our field is we cure people really fast. 5 to 10 days, and you're cured. You don't need more drug. So what I say is, just to simplify, it's basically your revenue is driven by the price and the number of patients. We're not going to un-engineer and suddenly be like, no, I made a new antibiotic that takes 2 years to cure you. We don't want to do that. So we're going to leave that number alone. So we only have 2 numbers to play with. If you accept costs are what they are and revenues need to go up, there's only 2 numbers that can go up, the price or the number of people. So thinking about this, in the US, theoretically, you can charge any price you want. That's not true in Europe. The government tells you what you can charge. The problem in the US, where I'm focused here, is that the hospital itself, when you're in certain situations where most of the patients are, is generally eating the cost of the antibiotic. So if they have to use a very expensive antibiotic, that comes out of the hospital budget, not the insurance or not Medicare in general. So that's one of the great challenges. I can say, I only have a very small number of patients, so I need to charge a very high price. But for those patients, predominantly, the hospital is the one paying the price for the drug. And that's just the way the system is set up. And that's where I have a footnote for a piece of legislation that's meant to address that issue. That you can't just increase the price to make it like an orphan drug, because they would go bankrupt. We're seeing this with COVID even as a big challenge. The hospitals are hurting because they're eating the costs. So it makes companies shy away from pricing proportional to the low number of patients. And then the number of patients, it's really, there are issues with lower use because of economics, and people call this out like, well, people are saving these drugs. And that is true. If we fix the economic piece, I bet you we see a lot more use, because a lot of the stewardship claims are really economically driven. This is an opinion. But we have to acknowledge that some of these drugs are for pretty small populations, like carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter. It's a pretty low number. No matter what it is, it's still less than 10,000 patients probably in the US. And we can't do anything to make the number of patients go up other than wait. And so that's the other limit that we have to think through. We're limited by a little bit of not using it on the right people at all times because of these economic concerns we're trying to address with disarm in the US. But also that, let's be fair, there aren't that many people with these diseases when we first launch. There's going to be a ton of patients later when the drug's generic, but not right now. So then the last piece is, so what are we trying to do? In the US, for price, it's really the Disarm Act is something we're trying to do, where it says basically if a hospital uses a new drug, they get reimbursed. And that takes economic incentive out to use a new product because the hospital is not losing money anymore. And then, of course, the other side, and there's a bunch of different acts, but Pasteur was the most recent. That's where you can't change the number of people that have the disease, but you can say, well, society, the US government or the British government or the Swedish government is going to pay you for more use than we actually have patients right now. They call it a subscription model. So that's sort of the other way. But if we don't increase the price or the number of patients, and there's 2 ways to increase patients, wait till there's more patients, which nobody wants us to do, but what are we going to do? Or artificially inflate the patients by having a subscription model. Those are really the 2 choices. And I'm not sure of having an opinion how we solve it, but hopefully the takeaway is there's a limited window to make back money to make the entire enterprise worth it. And somehow we have to get that money up. It's just not sufficient to warrant the investment. And so these are the different thoughts, and people are, right now, I think the good news is we're in a place where everyone agrees we have to do something, and the is really around how. Is it pure pricing? Is it a blend of like some kind of subscription plus pricing? And I stay away from weighing in on it, as long as it's a total dollar amount that makes the entire investment worth it. However, we recover that. And so that's the summary. So there's a limited window we can get the money back. Not only are we not returning invested dollars for development, we're not even breaking even on the market. I showed you and that drug deserves more revenue for what it is and what it brought to the world. Our costs are kind of in line, and so our revenues are really the problem. And the only way to get the revenue up is we either price higher or we have to increase volume. Those are the only two numbers. And volume, we can either inflate it now artificially through prescriptions or some other way, or we can wait till there's more people. And the crisis is really huge, and the market makes sense. But in the current system, the numbers of patients just don't make the market work. The math breaks. And so I'll leave this up as background. The speakers that participated in the 2-hour session are listed because I used some of their content, and then my colleague Arthur, who helped me with some of the revenue searching for some of the drugs and some links to some of those sessions. But just really appreciate the opportunity to share the story and yield the floor.
Okay, Ryan, thank you very much for your very impressive and great presentation, and very insightful. And I think you have shown the challenges, the hurdles, the difficulties, but also the impossibilities, if I may say, involved in research and development and commercializing novel antimicrobial products. Obviously, this webinar is not meant to discourage people, but merely to show them the reality at an early stage, such that people may anticipate and will take preventive actions to the extent possible. Really a very great presentation. I also greatly appreciate the honesty with which you present this this case story. We have some questions so far, and I would like to start with. I have to scroll down a little bit. Yes. We have here the first question asked by Raymond, asking that given this typical high drugs development costs, is it not possible or even desirable for national governments to make deliberate policies for the regulatory agencies to reduce these costs? Or possibly to increase post-approval taxes as well as typical market push or pull mechanisms to make it more attractive to develop and commercialize antimicrobials. Ryan, can you comment on that?
Yeah, and I lost just a piece of what you said, but I think I got the gist. But if I missed something, please correct me. So if we got the development costs, I know it's hundreds of millions of dollars, but I think the FDA has done a dramatic shift and made it really clear how to get drugs approved. But you're right. I keep getting stuck on, we have to make the returns go up in the branded years, knowing that society was going to use these things for cheap forever after that, and parts of the world. And we want to get these drugs. The saddest thing at the end at Achaogen was I know the data from outside the US, especially in Africa and Asia, and it's bad. And we were working on things for parts of that world. And if we don't fix the marketplace here, there are a lot of people actually outside the US that need those products. And we have to create a market here and in Europe and other places to support those products for the rest of the world. But again, yeah, I'm still stuck on our job is to arrive early in tech. So I live in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley. In technology, if you come too soon, you get punished, and that's your fault, right? The world wasn't ready for Lyft before iPhones, but we're supposed to come early, and we get punished, and it's just like, come on, people, we got to fix this, or we're not going to do it anymore, But so let me. What parts of the question did I miss? I'm trying to think. So we need to get the revenues up. How is a big question. There's ways to raise money. There's ways to incentivize, but I don't think anyone wants us to wait till there's 2 million patients a year. That's where the math works really well. So I just try to draw the attention to whatever way we want to get the money up, it'll work again, and then stop short. But I know there are really smart people, and there are groups like Antimicrobial Working Group we can look to for their policies on how they think we should do it. And I just stop and say, as long as you get the revenue up, I can get someone to invest in a new idea I have and bring it back to approval again.
Yeah, I can imagine. You were talking about the technology markets. The second question is about by Anand, and he's asking, well, what is the situation with oncology drugs? Why do these oncology drugs not face the same challenges?
Yeah, it's I mean, they price high. You know, do you remember daptomycin? People used to say it was obscenely expensive and it infuriated people. Do you recall the price? I think it was about $200 a day for like 7 days. Like, we're in microscopic linezolid, Zyvox was about $100, and people were infuriated. And it's just, we're in a different universe. So I think they charge a lot more. But the thing with antibiotics in the US especially, this is unique, is so we have this system where if you're hospitalized, it's called the bundle payment, the DRG. You get a fixed payment to cure you. And the analogy I use is like a mechanic. I wrote this on LinkedIn recently. It was like, imagine you wrecked your car and your insurance said to the mechanic, here's $10,000 or $5,000 to fix this car. Whatever you don't spend fixing it, you keep. Do you think they're going to use the best parts in that car? And yeah, maybe, but those mechanics will be out of, and hey, maybe the right part costs $50,000. They can't use that. So we have this kind of perverse incentive to make you cut costs. And I get why it was created. It wasn't meant to be evil, but in the new world of AMR, it's kind of perverse and evil. So you have an incentive to use cheaper drugs, even the generics. I think there's a heavy use of Piptazo over other generics, and it's a lot cheaper. And it's not good. We got to fix that. And that's where Disarm is an attempt to get rid of that negative incentive. But that's why oncology is reimbursed different. And people also just accept it's okay to charge more because it's cancer. They're used to their antibiotics being so cheap. I mean, amoxicillin for my son last year, $8. $8 for 10 days. People, and then when I go to 8,000, it's so extreme. I think people can't handle that shock because we're not used to not having antibiotics.
There's another question which is maybe illustrative for what you were saying in your presentations. So by John Hayes saying that the number of scientific publications about new antibiotics from whatever sources is high, is ridiculously high, when compared to the actual number of antibiotics that's coming to the market. Would this mean that a lot of novel compounds, novel molecules are being discovered and published, but that they are simply not further developed because of, whatever you have presented in your presentation?
Again, all opinion. So science, I used to only give talks on why we can't find any new mechanism agents because the science is so hard. That's my favorite to talk about. This just became because if we don't fix this, it doesn't matter if we fix the science. It's incredibly hard science, and you almost forget that. Gram-negative antibiotic discovery, think about it. There's only one drug class that works in the cytoplasm of Pseudomonas and doesn't get some freaky uptake mechanism evolution found. That's the quinolones. That's all. In all of history. Think about how so there could be. My fear is we can't take the kinds of risks that other fields can take because we're so starved out for capital. If I'm going to do something, it's 95% likely to work and it's still not worth that much. That's what's so crazy about our field. So I think the higher risk moonshot ideas don't get the capital they deserve because the value's not there. So yeah, I agree. And at the end of the day, my fear was always back at Occasion in the early years when I was pretty confident we'd fix this stuff before we got to market, and we didn't, but I thought we would, was that we'll fix it and everyone will come running back and say, now we'll make new gram-negative drugs because they fixed the market, but they forget it's really hard. We mostly fail. And so, those compounds, we should be writing them down, but they're not getting the investment they deserve because the value's not there versus cancer. I agree.
Yeah. Another question here is, by the way, many questions come in, and we have another 6 minutes left, so we cannot answer all the questions. I apologize for that. Here's a question asked by Christine saying, why can the cost of clinical trials be lower by performing in, why can't the cost of clinical trials by performing them in countries with higher levels of resistance and then show superiority? Well, this question is not fully clear to me, but maybe you can tell something about
Yeah,
Ryan about.
this is Raj. I think she corrected that question later on. What Christine is trying to say is, again, I'll repeat her question. What she meant was, why can't the cost of clinical trials be lower by performing them in countries with high levels of resistance and then show that these are superior for MDR infections? If that makes sense,
Yeah.
Ryan. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, because you can't. And we proved it. So if you look at our colistin trial back in when there was no avibactam or Vabomere or any of those drugs, we had CRE increase, and we attempted to do that, right? And there's a million reasons. There's a whole 8-hour workshop, so I don't want to. I want to be brief here, but why those trials generally, even the regulators agree we shouldn't be doing them anymore. But the bottom line is you cannot enroll resistance to the comparator in the trial. So you can go to India where there's a ton of CRE, but if you're not enrolling a patient in an arm that's active, you can't enroll them. So colistin resistance was an exclusion criteria in our trial, despite the fact, you could have shown superiority. So what we had was an open label arm that just showed, it was a salvage arm, like a cancer trial, where you said, okay, if you're colistin resistant, you get plasmamycin only. And at our advisory committee, every single person ignored that data and said, there's no control. So we proved it. You can't enroll resistance to the comparator, and that's why we can't do superiority. It's not about numbers of people. It's just a faulty logic gap. Yep. We prove superiority through microbiology and PKPD. Yep. That's how we do it. And doctors are going to have to get used to that.
That's interesting. Yeah. So Martin, if I may, we still have 4 minutes. I'll try to combine 3 questions which I'm seeing here, so that way we answer most of the questions. So the first, the questions were from Kristen and also from Mohammed, and also going back to your equation, as I call it, cost to be less than prices, and one of the variables around funding. So the question would be, after hearing your story, it seems like the big pharma are acting philanthropically to continue with antibiotics. What would be your view and expectations when the commercial landscape will change to make it viable for antimicrobial developers? For example, artificial increase in volume, and that pertains to my thought process based on our previous experience, Ryan. Is the VC landscape changing for this space, considering what we're going through? And pertaining to one of the variables is the patent term. The question was from Mohammed. Can regulatory bodies be requested to extend the patent period for antimicrobial agents, so that way you have further protection to protect that antimicrobial product? Over to you, Ryan.
All right. Well, the problem is I paid really close attention, so I only remember the last question now. We do have
first question. Sorry, Ryan.
Let me
the first question is that
you come back in.
Okay, go ahead.
So for the patent term, theoretically, yes, right? So if you take the revenue and stretch it out longer, the problem is the further the dollars are, and I'm not good enough at math for this, but someone that does finance, the further the dollars are out in the future, the more you need of them to make it count all the way back 20 years earlier. And so it's probably not the best solution, but it's a solution. And QIDP does give you that. That's the reason avibactam is not going off patent in 2 years, I think. I don't want to speak too much about one person's drug, but we have that. But if you imagine the revenues aren't that high and you're pushing that money out, like, hey, I'll give you $20, but I'm going to give it to you in 2050, it's going to be discounted backwards, and so you'll get a lot more of it. So I don't think that's favored, but in theory, mathematically, yeah, if it brings enough back, it should work. All right, go ahead, Raj.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So I'll combine the 2 questions now. So considering the changing landscape, what we're going through, do you envision the landscape to change if the VC mindset changes, and also if big pharma continue to fund such programs philanthropically with antibiotics? So the bottom line is, what is your view and expectation when commercial landscape will change to make it more viable for antimicrobial developers?
For the U.S., we need the legislation. We're down to that. I think every government agency, from the FDA to Medicare to other leaders like BARDA, they can't necessarily take positions, but they agree we need to fix this. And it's just the legislature. And honestly, it sounds like it's down to settling on how. There's even a general agreement from what I've heard that we need to do it. And so if we don't fix the marketplace, that's what will drive it. You know, some of the pharmas may take an early lead. I doubt they do it forever charitably, but if they're hedging that, hey, we're going to fix this soon, why don't we have a pipeline? But if you don't fix it, I don't see them staying in it forever, because it's just not fair to their shareholders. It's not their job to lose money on purpose. It's actually a breach of their fiduciary duty.
Great. Thank you. So, Martin, I think we are just at the end of our 1 hour. We have several questions. As Martin indicated, we'll put this recording on our website. But Martin, for closing comments, please.
Sorry, Raj, what did you say?
Can you please give a closing comment? I think we are on the hour. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes. Well, first of all, Ryan, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Thank you to have you with us during this first webinar, this kickoff webinar. I think we have learned a lot from you, and I'm sure that many of the participants have learned a lot. I also see some very nice comments about your presentation. As we already said, the webinar is being recorded, so the link will be spread. You can all those who are interested can have another listen to the webinar. I also would like to thank all the participants for joining this webinar. And this is only the first one. There will be more webinars in the future. And on behalf of Raj, I also invite you to follow the information and we hope that you will attend upcoming webinars as well. Thank you very much and have a great day. All the best to all of us.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.